Prices don't randomly go up. It might feel that way when a grocery bill suddenly jumps or rent creeps higher every year, but there's always a chain reaction behind it. Inflation isn't chaos, it's a system, a machine. And once that machine starts moving, it affects everyone differently. At its core, inflation is what happens when money loses value over time. Not because money physically changes, but because what it can buy starts shrinking. The same $100 that used to fill a cart now barely covers a few bags. Nothing about that feels abstract. It's immediate, it's personal, and it hits every single person regardless of income, job, or lifestyle. The simplest way to understand it is this: too much money chasing too few goods. That's the entire game. When there's more money available than the number of things people can buy, prices go up. Not because businesses are randomly greedy, but because they can. If more people are able and willing to pay, prices naturally rise to match that demand. Money itself behaves like a product. It has supply and demand just like anything else. When money is scarce, it becomes more valuable. When there's a lot of it, its value drops. That's when inflation kicks in. Each dollar starts doing less work. Imagine a tiny world with only three people, all holding the same amount of money, all buying from the same store. Everything stays balanced. But suddenly, all three get extra cash. The store doesn't magically produce more goods overnight. Instead, it raises prices. Not out of spite, but because demand just increased without supply catching up. That's where the cycle begins. Now scale that tiny example to an entire country, then to the entire world. That's inflation in real life. But here's where things get interesting. Inflation doesn't just happen on its own. It's influenced, shaped, and sometimes even encouraged by the people running the economy. Governments and central banks don't just react to inflation. They play a role in creating it. That might sound unsettling, but there's a reason behind it. Modern money isn't backed by gold or any physical asset. It's what's called fiat currency. Its value comes from trust. People believe it has value, so it does. That also means more of it can be created when needed. And that ability to create money is one of the most powerful tools governments have. When economies slow down, when businesses struggle, when people lose jobs, governments step in. They inject money into the system. They lower interest rates. They make borrowing easier. All of this is designed to get people spending again, to keep businesses alive, to prevent economic collapse. But there's a trade-off. More money in the system means more pressure on prices, and sometimes that pressure builds fast. A perfect example of this played out during the global pandemic. At first, something unusual happened. Inflation didn't spike right away. It actually dropped. That's because everything slowed down. Businesses closed. People stayed home. Spending decreased. Demand collapsed. At the same time, production also slowed. Factories shut down. Supply chains broke. Goods became harder to produce and deliver. So now there were fewer products being made, but also fewer people buying them. Then things changed. Governments stepped in with massive financial support. Trillions of dollars flowed into the economy. Stimulus checks went out. Businesses received loans. Unemployment benefits increased. At the same time, people weren't spending much because there was nowhere to go and nothing to do. So savings piled up. When restrictions eased and the world started opening again, all that saved money suddenly hit the market. People started spending again, and they did it fast. But the supply side hadn't recovered yet. Factories were still catching up. Shipping was still delayed. Workers were still returning. There weren't enough goods to meet the sudden surge in demand. That's when inflation took off. It wasn't just one factor. It was a perfect storm. More money, fewer goods, and a system trying to restart all at once. Energy prices played a major role too. During the early stages of the pandemic, energy demand dropped sharply. Production slowed because companies didn't need to produce as much. Then, demand came roaring back faster than supply could respond. Add geopolitical tension into the mix, especially disruptions in major energy-producing regions, and prices skyrocketed. Oil prices jumped dramatically, and since energy affects nearly everything, transportation, manufacturing, food production, those costs spread throughout the entire economy. Every product became more expensive to make and deliver. At the same time, borrowing money became incredibly cheap. Central banks cut interest rates to near zero. Loans, mortgages, credit cards, everything became easier to access. That meant even more money flowing into the system. So now there was a situation where people had more cash, could borrow more easily, and were eager to spend. Meanwhile, goods were still limited. Prices had only one direction to go, up. And they went up fast. Inflation reached levels not seen in decades. Numbers that were supposed to stay around 2% suddenly jumped to 7%, then 8%, even higher at certain points. That gap matters more than it sounds, because what really determines how people feel isn't just inflation itself. It's the relationship between inflation and wages. If incomes rise at the same pace or faster, people can keep up. But when prices rise faster than wages, purchasing power drops. That's when frustration kicks in. That's when people feel like they're working just as hard, or even harder, but getting less in return. And that feeling spreads quickly. Inflation affects everyone, but not equally. Some people benefit from it, others pay the price. Borrowers, for example, can actually gain from inflation. If someone takes out a loan and inflation rises, the value of the money they repay is lower than when they borrowed it. In simple terms, debt becomes easier to handle. On the other hand, savers lose. Money sitting in a bank account loses value over time. Even if the number stays the same, what it can buy decreases. Businesses can sometimes pass higher costs on to consumers. Workers can't always do the same. Wage increases often lag behind price increases, especially during sudden inflation spikes. That gap creates pressure on everyday life. Groceries become more expensive. Gas costs more. Rent climbs higher, and unlike some economic problems, inflation doesn't affect just a small group. It touches everyone. That's why it feels so overwhelming. There's also a psychological layer to it. People tend to react more strongly to losses than gains. Even if wages are rising, the visible increase in prices feels worse. Seeing a higher number at the checkout hits harder than noticing a slightly larger paycheck. It creates the sense that things are getting worse, even in situations where income might technically be keeping up. But in many cases, especially in recent years, wages didn't keep up. That's what made the post-pandemic inflation period so intense. Prices rose quickly, while wage growth slowed down. The balance broke, and when that happens, the pressure builds. Governments and central banks then face a difficult choice. Let inflation continue or step in and slow it down. Slowing it down isn't painless. The main tool used is raising interest rates. When rates go up, borrowing becomes more expensive. People take fewer loans. Businesses invest less. Spending slows down. That reduces demand, which helps stabilize prices. But it comes with consequences. Higher interest rates mean higher mortgage payments. Credit card debt becomes more expensive. Buying a home becomes harder. Economic growth slows. So the same system that was used to boost the economy now has to be reversed to cool it down. That's the balancing act. Too much inflation causes instability. Too little inflation can be just as dangerous. If prices stop rising or start falling, something called deflation, people begin to delay spending. Why buy today if things might be cheaper tomorrow? That behavior slows the entire economy. Businesses earn less, cut costs, reduce hiring, and the cycle continues downward. That's why most economies aim for a small, steady level of inflation. Around 2% is considered ideal. It encourages spending without letting prices spiral out of control. It keeps the system moving, because at the end of the day, modern economies depend on movement. Money has to circulate, people have to spend, businesses have to grow. Inflation, in controlled amounts, helps make that happen. But when it goes beyond control, the consequences can be extreme. And that's where things shift from uncomfortable to catastrophic. When inflation slips out of control, it stops being an inconvenience and starts becoming a crisis. Not the kind that shows up overnight with alarms and headlines, but the kind that slowly breaks the system people rely on every single day. At extreme levels, inflation turns into something called hyperinflation. That's when prices don't just rise steadily over time, they explode, not 5% a year, not even 20%. Think 50% or more annually, and in the worst cases, far beyond that. At that point, money itself starts losing meaning. There have been moments in history where prices doubled not in years, not in months, but in days. Sometimes even hours. In those environments, holding on to money becomes a losing strategy. The longer it sits, the less it's worth. So behavior changes. People rush to spend money the moment they receive it. Paychecks don't get saved. They get used immediately. Waiting even a day could mean paying significantly more for the same item. Stores stop printing price tags because they can't keep up. Numbers change too quickly. Daily life becomes unstable. One of the most extreme examples happened in Hungary after World War II. The country's infrastructure was devastated. Factories were destroyed. Production collapsed. On top of that, there were massive financial obligations to cover. The economy needed to restart, but there were barely any goods being produced. In a situation like that, the logical move would normally be to reduce the money supply to control inflation. But instead, money was pushed into the system aggressively. The idea was to stimulate activity, to rebuild, to get things moving again. And in a way, it worked. Economic activity did pick up, but the cost was staggering. Inflation spiraled so far out of control that it reached numbers almost impossible to comprehend. Prices were doubling within hours. People carried massive stacks of cash just to buy basic necessities. At one point, the government issued a banknote with a value so large it barely made practical sense. Savings were wiped out. Wages became meaningless. Pensions lost their value entirely. The currency itself stopped functioning as a reliable tool. When money can't hold value, the entire system breaks. People start turning to alternatives. Bartering becomes common. Goods replace currency. Trust shifts away from money and toward tangible items. Eventually, the situation becomes unsustainable. The only way out is a complete reset. A new currency replaces the old one, essentially starting from scratch. A similar situation played out decades later in Zimbabwe. The causes were different, but the outcome followed a familiar pattern. Economic instability, poor policy decisions, declining production, and excessive money creation all collided. Food production dropped significantly. The country needed to import essentials while also managing internal financial pressure. To deal with it, more money was printed. At first, it might have seemed like a solution. More money meant more ability to pay for things, at least on the surface. But without an increase in goods and services, that extra money only pushed prices higher. Inflation didn't just rise, it accelerated. Numbers climbed into the millions, then beyond. The currency lost value so quickly that even large denominations became nearly useless. Everyday transactions required enormous amounts of cash. At one point, the exchange rate reached levels where local currency was essentially worthless compared to foreign currency. People adapted the only way they could. They stopped using the local currency altogether. Instead, they turned to more stable foreign currencies, like the US dollar. Transactions shifted away from traditional cash. Digital payments and alternative systems became more common, not out of convenience, but out of necessity. Banks struggled to keep up. Accessing money became difficult. Withdrawal limits dropped dramatically. Even having money in an account didn't guarantee access to it. The system didn't just weaken, it transformed. These extreme cases highlight something important. Inflation isn't just about prices going up, it's about trust. Trust in money. Trust in the system. When that trust breaks, everything built on top of it starts to collapse. But most economies never reach that level. Inflation doesn't just run wild in most economies. It's actively managed. But that control doesn't come from a single authority. Instead, it's shaped by a network of decisions made by governments and central banks, using tools like interest rates and money supply to steer the economy. When growth slows, rates are lowered and more money flows into the system to encourage spending. When inflation rises too fast, rates go up to cool things down. Simple in theory, but every move creates ripple effects. Lower rates make borrowing easier, boosting spending, investment, and jobs. But they can also push prices higher. Higher rates slow inflation, but they can strain households, reduce spending, and even increase unemployment. There's no perfect balance, only constant adjustment. That's why many economies aim for around 2% inflation, enough to keep money moving, but stable enough to avoid chaos. Even then, inflation doesn't treat everyone equally. Asset owners often benefit, while savers and fixed income earners feel the squeeze. Over time, if wages don't keep up with rising prices, everyday life becomes harder. And that's when inflation shifts from background noise to a real personal problem. And unlike some economic challenges, inflation doesn't offer easy personal solutions. Working more hours doesn't change prices. Saving harder doesn't prevent value loss if inflation is high. It creates a sense of limited control. That's why understanding it matters. Not to eliminate it, because that's not possible in a modern economy, but to recognize how it works, who influences it, and how it impacts different parts of society. Because inflation isn't just an economic concept. It's a reflection of decisions, systems, and trade-offs. Governments inject money to stabilize economies, knowing it may lead to higher prices. Central banks adjust interest rates, knowing it will affect borrowing, spending, and growth. Businesses adjust prices based on costs and demand. Consumers react based on their own financial situations. All of these actions combine into a single outcome: rising or falling prices. So when looking at inflation through the lens of who decides, who profits, and who pays, the answer isn't simple. Decisions come from policymakers trying to manage a complex system. Profits often go to those positioned to adapt quickly: asset holders, businesses with pricing power, borrowers in the right conditions. And the cost is spread across everyone, but felt most strongly by those whose income doesn't keep up. That's the reality of it. Inflation isn't random, it isn't purely accidental, and it isn't entirely avoidable. It's built into the way modern economies function. The goal isn't to eliminate it, but to manage it, to keep it in that narrow space where it supports growth without eroding stability. And that balance, more than anything, determines how the economy feels to the people living inside it. Because at the end of the day, inflation isn't just about numbers on a chart, it's about what those numbers mean in real life. The cost of a meal, the price of a home, the value of time and effort, and whether all of it feels like it's moving forward or slipping further out of reach. If this breakdown helped make sense of how inflation really works, what drives it, and why it affects everyday life the way it does, consider subscribing for more deep dives that turn complex topics into clear, engaging stories.